We've done it before with minor pentatonic. Now we're going to do it with major pentatonic easy shape. Step 1 is memorize where the roots are. Find the best places to bend. Memorize where the blue note is. Find the chord tones that are good to resolve on. Learn the important triads or arpeggios in the shape. And of course, memorize some cool licks. If you want to get good at the pentatonic scales, it's not just about memorizing the shapes. That's really just step 1. There's so many more things we've got to do. You got to know the character of each note in that scale because they all have a different personality. So let's do this 6 steps. We've done minor pentatonic for all 5 pentatonic shapes on our Patreon here, and in this particular video we're going to do major pentatonic because the roots are in different places, right? The things have really shifted around. Target notes are in different places. And arpeggios and triads are in different places because now we're thinking major. And major pentatonic is, remember, it's the same shapes, right? Minor pentatonic and major pentatonic are the same shapes, but the first finger pinky rule gives us that. Pinky on C here on the 8th fret, play easy shape, and I've got C major pentatonic. But now let's do step 1. Where are the roots in major pentatonic? Well, pinky rule already tells us that, but we need to know more than just the lowest one. Sure, that's how we find the scale shape, but again, we gotta know more than just the shape. We wanna know that that's a root right there as well. And why? Because that is an ideal place to end any kind of lick, especially on the 1 chord, but even almost at any time in that key. It's always going to sound finished. It really helps us to have good phrasing. And that one there is the perfect root, right? If we think back to minor pentatonic, this would have been A minor pentatonic, right? It's in a different spot. That's the root when it's A minor pentatonic. It's kind of funny to get your head around that. The same pentatonic shape, different context. Now we're in the context of C, and there's a nice root that's kind of nice range inside this shape for ending a lot of licks. And we've got that one, we've got that one. We have this one up here too. You could end licks there. I don't tend to end licks there as often. It's kind of nice, but it's high up. I like this. I like that more mid-range there for resolve to the root. Okay, so that was step 1. That's pretty easy. Now, we've got to memorize the best places to bend. Interestingly, when we did this as A minor pentatonic, the best places to bend were here, because that's where every blues guy bends, and here, because that's where every other blues guy bends, and here. And they all sound good. This is the same for major pentatonic, but the context is different, right? So they're going to resolve differently when we bend these notes because the context is likely the chords C, F, and G. C, F, and G is 1, 4, 5 in major, right? And so we have a very different resolve when we bend these notes. For example, if I take this bend, what I call our most favorite bend, is that what I call it? Something like that. That one there, 7th fret of the G string. We like those bends because it's under the 3rd finger, right? So it's easy, we can give it a lot of support. But when it's major pentatonic, that is actually the 2nd note of the scale. That was the root, right? That's the 2, the 2nd note. And if we bend that up a whole step, we get the pitch of the major 3rd. So on the chord, that's a C chord there, it's gonna resolve really well. And so we wanna know that. We wanna be able to hear that nice resolve to the major 3rd of that chord. And then we can resolve it back to the root as well if we like. Let's do our second favorite bend. And that's this one, also under the third finger, conveniently, right? It's also a favorite bend when we're in minor pentatonic, but again, the context is different. When we use these bends, we want to know what it's going to sound like in advance. We want to be able to hear what we're playing when we're improvising. And we want to know, what does this resolve to? What does it start on, right? It starts on a G. Well, a G is in the C chord, root, third, fifth. There's the G there. It's getting a lot of theory here, right? But when we bend it up a whole step, it's going to an A note, which is not in a C chord. That's okay. It's in the key, right? But it's not going to resolve against the 1 chord anyway. So bend that guy up. It'll sound cool. It'll sound kind of like a C6 chord. Kind of jazzy. Or if we want resolve, we just got to know we're going to bring that note back down to that note, because that's a G. That's gonna resolve against the key. A lot of the times your ear will tell you these things. So there's a bit of theory and there's a bit of using some ear training, but being able to combine both those things helps us to be able to really navigate the pentatonic scales and say what we want to say in the moment, right? Without hunting and pecking around and kind of not knowing what it's going to sound like before we play it. Sometimes we get disappointed if we do it that way. We want to know in advance always. And we're going to talk about that note a little bit later as a target note. But there we go. That's our second favorite bend. Third favorite bend, again, it's under the third finger. But what is it? It's a root. We talked about that. There's a root. So can we bend a root? Sure, we can bend a root. We can bend a root up a whole step. That'll take that C note to a D note, which is a 2 in the scale, C, D. Could sound like a C add 9 chord if you want to think of it that way. It'll sound cool against the chord. And maybe, like the other one, we want to bring it back down to resolve it to the root. That'll bring us the resolve. Now it depends on what chord we're on, right? If we go back to this one, that second favorite bend, we said that we were bending a G to an A. Well, what's the 4 chord in the key of C? The 4 chord in the key of C is F. Now that's gonna sound good because F has an A. That's a lot of knowledge to just know in the moment, right? I'm not saying that when you're improvising, you're always thinking, oh, well, I'll bend this one because it's gonna resolve to the 4 chord. It's not necessarily like that. But when we practice these concepts, then you can train your ear to hear what you want. Otherwise, again, you're just guessing. But hear that F chord there. And I'm gonna do that bend. And you can hear that it's resolving to that chord. Now, let's say the song goes back to a C chord. We might want to bring that back down, right? Because as we said, that note, that G, resolves against the C. Okay, now when we're improvising, we know where the good places to bend are, but we're also going to work on training our ear to hear when they resolve the way we want them to resolve. So that's bends. Now we got to know where the blue notes are. Well, the cool thing about easy shape, this is also why it's easy. If you already know easy shape minor pentatonic, A minor pentatonic, they're right there. It's the same, right? The context or the physical position of the blue note is the same. The context is different. Now, the blue note is a minor third. There's the blue note there. So it's there and there. You're going to memorize where those are so that whenever you want that bluesy sound, which it's not just blues, right? It's rock, it's country as well. That you have access to that. Now, talking about that blue note, and the bend, our favorite bend that we talked about before, we bent this one up a whole step before, right? But it could also be bent up a half step. Because if we bend it to a half step, that's that blue note right there. So that's also the most forgiving bend in a sense, because we can bend it almost anywhere. We want to try to be as accurate as possible against whatever chord we're doing, whole step. Right? That should resolve more or less to that chord, to that major third. Hopefully I got that right. Or to the blue note, which is so dissonant. That's why it's forgiving, that one. So now we've got blue notes, that guy, and you want a sneaky one? I love this one. I've talked about this one in one of the other YouTube videos. That's the same note as that blue note I showed you just a moment ago. I call that the hidden blue note, and we've got a video on that one. It's so handy to be able to slide there. It's an E flat, so it's the same thing. It's not a different harmonic sound, but because it's under a different finger and because you're sliding to the major third there, it just has a different sound, which normally when we're using the other blue note, we're using it in a different order of notes, and so it ends up being a different lick. Now, step 4 is to memorize what other chord tones are valuable to resolve on. We talk about the root a lot because the root is something that I resolve to a lot. I like that sound, but sometimes you want to have a phrase that ends with a bit of a question mark. And ending on the root is definitely not a question mark, right? So what about ending on, say, the major third? We got to memorize where that is. Now, if you have done my 6 steps to pentatonic mastery with the minor, you might be thinking, oh, well, that's the 5th, but it's not, right? Not for a C chord. It is the 5th in the context of a minor pentatonic. That sounds cool, but we're in major pentatonic. The song might not have an A minor at all in it. It might have an A minor, but it might not. It might be just C, F, and G, and then it's so funny, right? It's the same note. It's in E, but context changes the personality of that note. Major thirds are kind of happy, right? That's what they sound like. They sound nice. They sound pleasant. Rather than fifths, well, fifths sound very resolved, so it's a little different. So if I have a C chord and I play a lick and I aim for the major third instead of the root, I just jump there. You can see that now it doesn't sound so resolved in comparison to going to the root. I'll end on the root this time. There's the root, right? That sounds very final. So you can combine phrases. You can just improvise almost anything. When you have a target tone, as they call them, you end a phrase with a specific target tone, it really changes the personality of the phrase. I could start lower, end on the major third. It's a little open-ended. Do something similar, but end on the root. There, I put those together. Now, some people like to memorize a lot of licks, and they just have like a massive brain to hold all these licks. Some people prefer to have concepts like that, where you're basically improvising your own lick, but it's not totally random. You've got a favorite bend, you know where your blue notes are, and especially, this is the best one, the target tones, because the target tones really change the sound of your lick. And what happens before the lick isn't even that important. Those target tones are what make it melodic and what make it musical. Let's do another one. We'll find the fifth. There's a fifth right here. Again, we could just memorize it. We can just memorize these three are good target tones. Root, third, fifth. The fifth, again, has its own personality. It's more open-ended than the root, for sure. We know that root is very final, but that's not as final, right? You can hear it against the chord. That's a G note, is the fifth of the chord. It wants to be resolved. You can hear that. That lick was going to the 5th on the first half of the first phrase, you could say, and then landing on the root in the second half. That's how we're creating melody. And if the chord is changing, those target notes are going to sound a little different, right? Right now we're just talking about the root, the 3rd, and the 5th of the root chord. We could get really fancy if we wanted to, but honestly, if you look at the 4 chord, the 4 chord is F in the key of C, right? Guess what's inside an F chord? F-A-C. So the root also sounds great on the 4 chord. So if you're learning something here, just hit that like button for me. Now we're gonna do step 5, and that is to memorize a triad or even arpeggio. They're kind of related, right? Once we start to see chord shapes, we start to see arpeggio shapes, because what's an arpeggio? An arpeggio is just the notes of a chord in succession. So this is my favorite triad shape of all time because it's so easy to play, right? It's right there. How do I know that's the C triad? I could memorize it. I have memorized it, but I've memorized it because it's based on this easy standard bar chord shape. That bar chord shape is just a little below here, right? But if you've been following my channel, you know this lick for sure. There's the triad, and we want to visualize how it sits in easy shape major pentatonic. That's another great way to resolve a phrase, because solos don't have to just be all single notes, right? They could have triads, they could have double stops in them too. That's another video. But there's a perfect triad, root triad, C chord triad, right there in the shape. We could use that Jimi Hendrix style by kind of barring this finger and being a little bit more strummy with the right hand, getting more of those strings. That's a really cool sound. We can combine it with single note licks. That gives your licks more depth, more interest, and it also will really connect it to the chord underneath. Now, you do have to be careful that generally speaking, this triad is going to sound best when the song is on the 1 chord, when the song is on the C chord, right? It might luck out on some other chords, like an A minor, it'll work there too. But generally speaking, you've got to be listening to the chords underneath to do these kinds of triads, arpeggios, and target tones like we just talked about. If you're on our Patreon group, your homework is in the practice tips video below. But if you're just here on YouTube, I'll give you some homework as well. And that is, you gotta put on a jam track and improvise, but you've got to hit all of these 6 things at some point, right? Even if it's just once. You've got to make sure that you target the root, you've got to find your favorite bends, you've got to be able to play a blue note, you've got to hit a chord tone other than the root. It's got to be the 3rd or the 5th. You've got to play a triad or make it into an arpeggio. And you've got to turn them into licks, which in fact is step 6, is memorizing some licks in this shape. Now, there are tons of licks in this shape, and we've got some on the Patreon here below, but as an example, here's what your homework might look like. I don't have a jam track. I'll just play this freestyle, improvise this for you. So I gotta land on a root. There's one. I gotta play some best places to bend. There's a different target note. I gotta play a blue note. And I've got to play a target note that's not the root. And I've got to play that triad shape. And I've got to use that at some point in the jam track. If you haven't done our 6 steps lessons for minor pentatonic, I've got one of those on the screen here for you. My name is Blue Morris, and I teach guitar lessons on Patreon, YouTube, here in Vancouver, and I've got books available on Amazon. I'll see you in the next one.